you guys could talk. He shook his head.
We're just frozen.
Okay. Hi, welcome everyone to Change. Welcome our speaker, Nithya Sambasivan. She is a researcher at Google Research here in Fremont. Got her PhD out of Irvine, is a luminary in the ICTD space, so we're really excited to have her here. There you go.
Thanks, Curtis. Hey, thank you all for being here. It's lovely to come down here. I'm going to talk today about a body of work on gender equity online that was carried out for about 2 years. So I should note that this was work that was done when I was with an organization called Next Billion Users within Google. But for the past year, I've been with Google Research, working on a new research initiative, extending some of these concerns around fairness and equity, but into the space of AI more globally. And if we have time left at the end of the talk, I'll show you a little bit about the types of work that we're doing. So this is a project that was done in collaboration with a number of different universities and NGOs and activist groups around the world, but also several collaborators at Google, especially within the space of privacy and security. In particular, I want to call out Amna Batul, Noah Ahmed, Saneh Gaitan, and David Niemer as our collaborators in their countries. To get into the problem space, women make up half of the world's population. We know this. However, the internet, which is supposed to be a reflection of the physical world, is highly gender inequitable. According to the ITU, over 2/3 of countries worldwide have more male than female users. And it's not just about internet access. Devices themselves can see major disparities when it comes to gender. So according to GSMA, South Asia, which is a collection of about 8 countries, also known as the Indian subcontinent, has the highest amount of disparity when it comes to gender gaps between men and women in access to mobile phones. But it's not just South Asia. We can also see big gaps in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and the Middle East. There are a few structural factors at play as well, in addition to internet disparities, that prevent women from getting meaningful access online. There are fewer women in the workforce. For example, in Pakistan, only 22% of women are employed. And in India, it's about 24%. Now, this trend is actually disturbing because over the years, despite economic progress, the number of women in the workforce is actually declining because of other issues like safety, which I'll get into a little bit in the talk. But not having access to livelihoods restricts societal and economic access, which also impacts access to the internet per one's agency. Women are also more non-literate than men worldwide, and having lower literacy skills impacts societal access, but also basic functions online and one's relationship with internet technologies. So one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is to achieve gender equality worldwide. And we have to recognize that the internet is an important front in which this needs to happen. We have made tremendous progress as a technology community in improving the pipeline and representation of women in the workforce. But we have to fundamentally acknowledge that design and engineering choices that we make affects end users globally, and that is an important sphere within which to achieve gender equity. So with more people coming online over the next few years, here's an enormous opportunity to correct some of these inequities and biases that are reflected in today's technologies. So I'm going to talk to you about the broader research method that was used in this work, but for the talk itself, I'm just going to focus on the region of South Asia, basically from Akai and a soups paper. because of the geographic and cultural similarities in these countries. So the research was conducted through multiple research techniques, starting with qualitative research and then followed by quantitative surveys in 7 countries: Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. We, in total, spoke to about 4,000 participants, primarily women, but also men, and a few non-binary and gender non-conforming people. So the research was designed to be representative of various voices. So we sampled across ages, across incomes, ability levels, gender identities, occupations, and various other factors in order to get a diverse range of voices reflected in our findings. I'm going to be brief about these sections, but I'm happy to answer these in any follow-up questions in Q&A. Spent a lot of time and care in creating an ethical protocol with which we could conduct this research by working with NGOs and activist groups to get access to more sensitive groups. We put a lot of time into redaction of personally identifying data and also using protocols like same gender and same language moderation. Theoretically, this research is inspired by post-colonial feminism, which views women and non-binary people in parts of the global south in their own light, and as an exploration of neocolonialism with other factors in these contexts like caste, class, religion, race, and other dimensions. And we'll get more into this in some of the implications of this research. So yeah, broadly, we conducted interviews and focus groups and a follow-up survey. And all of these the research findings are summarized into this one slide. And you can read more about this at g.co/gender equity online, which is where we have a public report. But very briefly, I'm going to deep dive into privacy and safety here, but very briefly, in order to get meaningful access to the internet, we have to consider these 4 dimensions of access, content, privacy, and safety as simply a starting point. Under access, we see that time restrictions and mobility restrictions affect the agency with which women can go online. And we'll see that because there are fewer women online, there's also much less relevant content online and fewer incentives for them to go online. And then when it comes to privacy, in addition to online management of one's identity and data, it's equally important to think about the physical privacy on device. And that's something that I'll get into in this talk. And when it comes to safety, there's abuse that happens online, as well as physical abuse that women go through, where technology can play this dual role of both being problematic but also companion. So the big picture is that there is systemic exclusion of women and non-binary people online. For example, in 2017, it was reported that only 29% of internet users in India were women. So that's 71% male users. And with today's algorithms looking at behaviors and preferences of the majority data sets, we're primarily looking at male user behaviors and patterns when it comes to recommendations and predictions. And that also leads to curation biases, which then leads to fewer women online because there's simply not much use online. And in addition to other factors like harassment and antagonism that women face online, this all leads to simply less creation and less expression and just a lot more consuming, which leads to more less incentive to go online. So here we see this cyclical negative loop of fewer women online and having inequitable experiences online, leading to women expressing themselves less online. And the internet is actually just it's meant to be this rich ecosystem of people's voices. But we're not seeing that today. And it's important for us to acknowledge that and find ways to move towards a better internet. So I'm going to talk about the abuse side of the findings to begin with. This work was presented at CHI this year. So safety is actually one of the biggest barriers to women going online. It's not just about access to devices or access to infrastructure. How one feels online is one of the primary motivators or detractors to going online. And it's not just women that experience it's women's own perceptions of safety, but it's also their family and friends' perceptions of women's safety, which can prevent women from going online. So abuse is higher for women in general, as documented in research, and minority groups. And how people cope with abuse and the impacts that abuse can have can look very different in different parts of the world. So it's important to examine and extend the abuse literature into different cultural contexts in their own light. So the questions we ask here are, what types of digital abuse do women, in particular South Asian women, encounter? How do they cope with it? And what are the effects of the abuse on their lives? So to paint a picture of how internet abuse looks today, many parts of the global south are increasingly adopting social media platforms, particularly on mobile-first use cases. But social media platforms can be new fronts for patriarchal control as much as they can be empowering to women. Take the example of Vinupriya, who was a 21-year-old college-going student in south of India, whose photo was taken down from a social network and morphed into a pornographic image and circulated virally in her communities. Now, again, keep in mind that there are contextual and infrastructural factors here, like mobile-first use cases and tight-knit communities can mean that content can go viral very quickly in hyperlocal networks. So she was admonished. She was blamed for leaking her photo, when in fact she did not, and then she ultimately committed suicide. Vinupriya's story was reflected numerous times in our interviews in India. And in Pakistan, Kandil Baloch, who was a celebrity, a micro-celebrity on Instagram, a brave woman who would post bold pictures of herself, was murdered by her husband for her promiscuous image. Incidents like these may be few and far between, and they may even be extreme, but they resonate very strongly with women and non-binary people, and they act as precautionary reminders for why one should not express themselves online. We see in our research that abuse was actually experienced by 72% of our participants in one form or the other. And it's especially higher for the LGBTQ community that participated in our work, and women with disabilities, rural and low-income women. And the consequences can be pretty severe, as we'll see. Again, so here's a categorization of the major abuse threats that came up in our work: cyber stalking, impersonation, and personal content leaks. But it's important to recognize that even minor infractions can have devastating consequences for women in different cultural contexts. As simple as a stranger lifting a photo or a name of a person can be completely misused and lead to pretty severe consequences. So cyber stalking is threats that are related to incoming unwanted contact, such as friend requests, unwanted SMSs. Impersonation has to do with modification of one's image. And then personal content leaks is perfectly consensual content that is leaked in other unwanted contexts. So to go deeper, cyberstalking is the most common threat that we encountered in our research. And this takes place in novel ways. It's not just through social media platforms. This can happen through SMSs. It can even happen through classifieds platforms, as we see in this quote here. On social media platforms, they'll come and say, "I love you, come with me." Recently, I posted an ad for a scooter on a classifieds app, and even there, I got requests like, "Do you want to have sex?" they don't leave us alone wherever we go. This is a quote from a lady in South India. So there's persistent I love you and sexualized requests that women encounter wherever there are communication mechanisms. And people are pretty innovative with figuring out these communication mechanisms, which can be exploited to contact women and non-binary people. It can also manifest outside, more broadly through digital means. And numbers can be circulated through both digital and non-digital means. There was an incident which was reported in India a couple of years ago where phone numbers were collected from women who came to top up their phones in these prepaid mobile shops and cumulatively sold as packages to anyone who was interested in purchasing them. Today, with a phone number, you can create an account, you can add somebody, you can share their contact, and it's basically a vector with which you can establish an identity. So a number of women complained about receiving unwanted contacts when this happened in northern India. And abuse can happen through any of the vectors with which we establish identity, such as a phone number, a name, a photo, a location, even gender declaration, can all be prime, ripe vectors for enabling abuse. Impersonation has to do with copying the likeness of a victim, of a person to cause harm for them without their consent. So synthetic porn is a class of abuse that we encountered in our research. It's similar to what Vinupriya in the first example encountered, where one's image is taken and artificially stitched over sexualized pornographic content. And today, with innovations like deepfakes, this is actually pretty threatening and disturbing for women, especially public figures, not just celebrities, but just women more broadly, where their images can be very easily manipulated to look very real and circulated. The important thing to note here is that platforms do not alert their victims when these incidents happen. Today, there's no recognition of how when somebody downloads an image and manipulates it. So they find out, in our research, some of the participants who encountered impersonation found out through rather unfortunate means, through real-life consequences when they were being teased or humiliated by their community members. It was, in fact, too late. Impersonation can also take place through creating fake profiles. So by hacking or by using one's public profile, similar fake profiles can be created that can have a more promiscuous bent. And women are blamed for creating these profiles. So there was an incident in Pakistan where Mariam's photo, Mariam was a gym trainer, but when she was in school, her photo and identity were impersonated and circulated around. And her classmates in school suddenly looked at her in a new light, in a negative light. And then she found out that there was a fake profile of her. And then the principal admonished her for creating this profile. Another class of abuse is personal content leaks. And this is, in fact, the most incapacitating form of abuse, where non-consensually, content that is consensual is revealed in non-consensual contexts. And this can be perfectly ordinary interactions, such as friendly chats across genders, which can be taken and shared with family members, with more conservative members of society, or normally innocent photos, which can be turned into harmful content. There was an incident, again, in Pakistan, in Peshawar, which is in the northwest part of Pakistan, where a group was created on social media where male college students would regularly post contacts, and simply face images and phone numbers of their female colleagues in their colleges. And this went on for a while. This is actually it could be harmful, because having one's phone number, again, is this Pandora's box of contacting them. Or women can be blamed for not having any role to play here, even though they may not even know about their numbers being leaked. Women can be blamed here. So this went on for a while until an NGO stepped in, a women's safety NGO stepped in and filed reported abuse to the platform. And it took a week of back and forth translation. The page was in Pashto, which is not a very common language, even in Pakistan, and definitely not for tech platforms. So by the time the content was moderated, it took a week, and then the page was taken down, the group was taken down. But a week is a very long time in viral abuse. So the point here is that tech platforms may not even have ways to identify new forms of abuse, and abuse is not even standardized around the world. It may be perfectly normal to upload somebody's phone number or a photo in one context, but in this particular context, it can be extremely severe. As the NGO staff told us, posting a picture, sharing a girl's picture online may not be a big deal for US people, but a fully clothed photo can lead to suicide here in conservative regions of Pakistan. Another example of how women may not even know about content being created about them was in Bangladesh, where we heard from university faculty who were on a sexual harassment committee about how some of their college students would take pictures of women going about their daily lives in the college canteen and uploading these pictures to platforms to then ask questions like how much for her, implying that this may be a sex worker. So online abuse leads to often severe and harmful consequences for women and non-binary people, primarily emotional harm, but also reputational harm, where women in this particular South Asian context are often seen as the forebearers of the community's identity and the family's reputation. Tarnishing a woman's reputation equates to tarnishing the family's reputation. It can also lead to coercive romantic involvement, and in some cases even physical abuse, where women are blamed for the abuse incidents and that results in domestic violence. But women have a series of ways with which they cope with these abuse vectors. Interestingly, the way in which they resolve abuse, once abuse has happened, is by leaning on friends and family. 47% in our study. Tech platforms and law and order was not relied upon, was considered untrustworthy in our study, where only 2% reported to tech platforms and 1% to police. This is because of other challenges where tech platforms may not even have visibility, or users may not have visibility into abuse reporting functionality in tech platforms. They may not trust that something would happen in response for filing a complaint. Police themselves were viewed as harassers. And in some cases, the methods which are used in filing complaints in police stations can be further humiliating and harmful, where, for example, in Pakistan, an NGO that we spoke to told us how paper complaints need to be filed with physical evidence of abuse, and that can lie around in folders, in conference rooms, and on tables, and women are just not comfortable with that. In order to prevent abuse, there's a series of creative strategies at play. Some of them are to limit self-disclosure, simply limit free expression online, not put out information that can be vulnerable to attacks. Establishing common trust signals with any incoming contacts, such as looking at their profile pages and looking at mutual friends and other signals with which trustworthiness can be established. And using non-face photos. This is actually a very clever strategy that a number of women use, where instead of a face for a profile photo, they use images of pets, flowers, landscapes, religious quotes, which are not vulnerable to attacks like synthetic porn. So taken together, these findings point to how we need to understand abuse in different cultural contexts. It just can take very different material impacts and harms. And it's important to recognize the cultural relations in any cultural context. So for example, in South Asia, we see that family and friends play an important role. So even if tech platforms may not be the right solution, regardless of whether they're improved or not, it's important for family and friends, for example, to learn about internet security and ways of taking action when there's abuse. Formal platforms are not trusted in our study, and this is a large area for improvement. NGOs can act as critical bridges with technology platforms, like how we saw in the Peshawar case, where they can translate content or alert platforms to novel forms of abuse that are taking place. And even mildly sensitive context in perhaps mildly sensitive content in perhaps Western contexts can be pretty harmful in other parts of the world. So see part of the research. If you have any questions, I suggest holding on unless you have any clarification questions that I can quickly address. But if not, I'd like to get through some of the main points and then answer questions at the end. So as part of the same research, privacy was one of the salient themes. And this part is about device privacy. So we know from prior research that mobile phones devices in particular are often shared among family and friends, and sometimes even with strangers. And this is not an economic need alone. It is also a cultural need. Today, there are a lot more phones. I started out doing my research in this area. This was nearly 10 years ago. And today, there are a lot more mobile phones, and there's still a lot of sharing going on. And sharing can take place in many different ways. Monitoring can also be one of the ways in which sharing occurs, where somebody's phone is handed off to someone else to check over when they're not as comfortable with the technology, or to protect themselves from incoming harassment. And monitoring in our study was often viewed positively, not just as a surveillance tool. So we see that this prevailing paradigm of one user, one account, one device regularly breaks in many cases. So this part of the research, the inquiry was focused on how do women manage and control their privacy on shared devices. Now we know that people share devices, but what happens when sharing occurs? How do they exert their agency and their control over these devices and the content? The second question is wrong. So device sharing can take place through three primary ways. One is shared usage, simply handing off one's phone to someone else. It can take place through mediated usage, where one person makes use of and relies on another person to help them accomplish technological activity, like a mother leaning on her daughter to open a YouTube video. It can also take place through monitored usage, where co-located members can check on their devices, either intentionally or unintentionally. So we found that in our interviews, privacy had very different manifestations and meanings. It had a number of different connotations depending on the social class of the participant and their attitudes towards the concept itself. So in general, we found that it was a less desirable term for lower income participants. However, 5 minutes into the interview on the privacy section, we would find out that there were numerous privacy practices at play. So regardless of attitudes towards the term of privacy, there were still several privacy strategies that we saw at play, whether they were called privacy preserving or not. So we would often hear a version of this quote of privacy is not for me, it's for those rich women. So it's especially in lower income communities, it was associated with Western connotations such as genes and dating and closed doors, not as culturally accepted in many contexts. So what we saw was a series of practices which were actually performative. And these were performative because they were adapted to local values and relationships. For example, in a context where a mother refusing a phone to her husband or her brother-in-law is considered rude, she might actually manage her privacy so that she hands off the phone to the husband or the brother-in-law, where she still has control over the content. So we saw that there were a number of user strategies in negotiating individual privacy in these multi-user environments in line with social values and expectations. So this is a framework that we came up with, varying from least effective to most effective that we saw. So phone locks, app locks, aggregate and entity deletions, private modes, and avoidance. So I'm just briefly going to talk about a few of these. Phone locks are overt techniques where they were pretty much used to protect phones from strangers and acquaintances outside of close relations. As Jyoti from India says, since I want to prevent my kids from using my phone, I change my phone. I use phone locks, but the kids open it each time I change it. They're just too smart. And I have to change my PIN every week. And I've done it so many times I've forgotten the PIN. So family members know the passwords and PINs because they are around. And this technique was more useful to protect phones from strangers. App locks, which are a class of applications that again have PIN and password protection, some are hidden as well, can hide specific applications. So rather than a universal phone lock, they have more granularity where they can hide specific applications or folders. In this case, Sana talks to us from Pakistan about snooping incidents where she says, as I work in a beauty salon, I have to submit my phone to the receptionist when I go to work. I found out that some of my messages were read by somebody. So she asked me to install app lock, and I feel more secure now. But app locks can also lead to questions like, what are you hiding? Because the screen is visible. And that implies that there is some content that the user wants to hide from others. So these techniques offer more granular control than a one-size-fits-all PIN, but they're still observable by co-located members. And secrecy is not as valued as privacy by app locks, where sometimes invisibility matters in creating privacy rather than these overt screens that ask for passwords. We also found this class of privacy techniques that we call aggregate and entity deletions. So basically, this is ways to manage traces of browsing and information history online, such as deleting search history, deleting browser history, deleting a specific query on the phone from history. As Janaki says from India, when I search for something, it shows what else I've searched for before. Sometimes it can be a little cheap, or people can be judgmental for other people to see. So when my son uses my phone, he thinks, why is mother seeing all of this? So I just clear my search history every week. But this is a pretty tech-savvy behavior. We saw that there was a range of tech awareness with these techniques. This is one of my favorite quotes from this research, where Shaina from India says, when I watch a video that's a little bit not nice, then I search for 5 or 6 other videos to remove it. So she gets machine learning. She just doesn't have a way to exert control over her recommendations directly. So she watches other videos, which, if you think about it, is pretty costly for her. So deletions provide higher degrees of freedom in that there are no observable traces once they're gone from the phone. They allow flexibility and content management even offline. But they're hard to discover. Many of these are hidden behind long presses and drop-down menus, especially for new technology users, which we're going to see a lot more of over the next few years. These techniques are harder. Private modes, I'll just be brief here, were hardly discovered because, again, they suffer from discoverability issues. But as a concept, they were highly appreciated. In practice, they were not used as much. when we probed into them. And avoidance is one of the most effective techniques where there's the highest degree of control, just simply avoiding specific applications. A number of women talk to us about how they would avoid installing banking applications or mobile money applications because they did not want their spouses to know about the money that they were saving. However, avoidance also leads to simply less technology usage because one doesn't know how to exert control over it. So in general, our findings on device privacy point to how privacy is actually a culturally shaped understanding. And it's important to improve awareness around simply existing features. Covert privacy is often valued, but it's harder to discover. This is an important area for the privacy and security community to further investigate with multiple users. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the impacts that came out of this work. These are public launches. There are still some ongoing initiatives which are yet to see the light of the day. But I'll just talk to you about some of the product launches that came out of this work. So Google Go, which is Google Search designed for emerging markets from the ground up, a lightweight Google Search as an application, a more browsy Google Search, has now released an incognito feature to allow users in multi-user situations to delete their search queries and to have more positive connotations with sensitive searching. Neighborly, which is a Q&A platform to answer and share queries on communities, hyperlocal communities, so like a Nextdoor, but extremely hyperlocal. Again, designed for emerging markets, has architected their privacy and abuse infrastructure based on this research in collaboration with us, such as first name only profiles, so that full names of women are not, women in particular are not required by the application, no screenshot profile pictures, no direct messaging, and small radius communities where there's higher levels of trust with posting queries or responding to queries in the community. Google Maps launched a Stay Safer feature. This has been launched in India, where based on insights around physical safety, they have now created a feature where for example, if somebody takes semi-private transportation, like an auto rickshaw or an Uber, turning on this feature will alert them when the vehicle goes off-route, and they can alert their loved ones. Google Stations, internet safety and data safety was also done in collaboration. I didn't talk about this, but you can find more about this in our report, which is around limited role models that women have in particularly STEM fields in the global south. So in response to this finding, we shot and launched videos of top scientists in India that talk about their journeys into their scientific fields. This is done in collaboration with Divi Thakur. This research has not just led to product implementations and impact at Google. We've also shared this at the World Bank, at the United Nations, and other policy venues to think about the internet being a gender inequitable space and how we can move forward as a community to address these biases. That's the end of that portion, but I want to briefly talk to you about my current work, which is around the HCI of AI globally. So I'm with Google Research, where we're starting a new initiative around doing human-centered AI across different cultural contexts. So this is from our CEO. One of our clearest insights on AI so far is that its potential is greatest when paired with human intelligence. We believe that we can develop AI in a way that complements human expertise. So how do we really design AI in a human-centered way using HCI principles and design notions, given AI is all-pervasive and suffers from opacity issues. So our group aims to design for the global south to build relevant, ethical, and meaningful AI products for societies and cultures. So some of the research themes that we're starting to tackle include explainability and interpretability, privacy and consent, data in low resource contexts, Indic and African languages, culturally sensitive fairness and ethics frameworks, and AI for social good. Some examples of this work are datafication in low resource contexts, where I'm starting to understand the data pipeline in AI, from how we go from ground truth to data sets to cleaning and processing to making decisions to consent and literacy among end users. Other examples of work that has come out of our team, which is PAIR, or People in AI Research, is human AI collaboration in medicine. So how can highly technical experts like doctors make sense of visualizations or of machine learning outputs and trust the content, or go deeper into why these predictions were made. The guidebook, which is launched actually this year, is a seminal, I think, initiative to provide very practical advice on how to design for AI for designers. So this is the human-centered AI guidebook, drawn from a series of research studies and across Google Research. Other examples are tools that have come out of the group, such as the What If tool, which allow us to query outputs of models by simulating different conditions, the what if conditions. And Facets, which is a tool to explore data sets and understand the biases and issues that lie with these data sets. We're going to hire soon. So in various capacities, like full-time roles, postdocs, interns, collaborations. So happy to chat more if you're interested. And we invite conversations with folks across the HCI spectrum, from technical to social sciences, but also other areas such as linguistics, public policy, anthropology, and others. That's my contact. Happy to take any questions.
I was curious. I really liked the insights you had around security and privacy, and particularly about users, and like that there are multiple users on devices, and that some of these different security and privacy features maybe work better or worse in these different environments. I was curious what thoughts you had on actually like incognito first. Like you were talking about incognito being more discoverable, but it still seems like there's kind of, you're forcing users to discover it and think like, oh, I need to be operating in this private mode, versus like doing that by default and then opting into predictions or tracking. Like, what do you think about the posture is between those different things?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So far, the architecture has been to allow choice to the user when they intend to have the privacy mode. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Preserving privacy, regardless of one's intent, I think leads to other questions around do people recognize the value of it? Is it necessary? And so on. Primarily, we saw incognito in contexts where there were suspicions around government surveillance, particularly in Bangladesh. Yeah, I think it's an area of inquiry, I would say.
So you mentioned that you did some overlap with policy, like speaking to the World Bank, things like that. Could you say more about, I guess, maybe reactions to this work and how they plan on incorporating it into more public policy oriented technology and government scale.
So that's ongoing work, and I think in general, any work with governments and policymakers is a larger undertaking and slow-moving piece. From what I can tell, the value that this work has added is in expanding our understanding of access issues, which have primarily in the policy community been seen as infrastructure access. But beyond infrastructure, what we are seeing is that women are coming online, and they will continue to come online, and these gaps will close over time. But their experiences are still not equitable because of safety issues, because of lack of relevant content, privacy, and other factors. So I think it's how the value add has been more in how engineering choices and really the design choices that go into the internet can lead to more equity for the policy audience.
About different ways that women get, I guess, protection from abuse, and you were looking at 47% of them was just from family, and then a few, like 1% went to the police or whatever. What about the remainder of women? Are there, because there's maybe like, 30-something% that you didn't account for? Are they just not seeking anything out?
So this is a multiple choice question. So basically, a number of women actually ignore the abuse. They try to not think about it, ignore it, close out their accounts, move on. A number of other women rely on their friends and family to deal with the abuse.
I was wondering if you had any other insights generated that were not as a part of the research questions initially on gender norms or socialization of women accessing ICTs in general? What, like, was behavior like any differentiation by age, by
Yeah, I think in general, these are very broad generalizations because this is research done in 7 countries with 4,000 participants. So it doesn't do a lot of justice to the nuance that we saw in the research, but just to keep it short, some of the cuts that we saw in the data were urban women were a lot more, had a lot more access to the internet, but they encountered a lot of issues with safety. Particularly physical safety. Rural women were found it a lot harder to access the internet, and there were the local social structures had a very important and large effect on their access. So it wasn't an individual's choice alone. It could also be other family members, like a brother saying, hey, you know what, internet is not good for you because you can get requests from random strangers, or women that use the internet are not of good character, so I don't want you to use the internet, I'm protecting you. So there are a lot of other members that ultimately shape access to the internet. We saw in general, although our numbers were pretty small, because, so I want to acknowledge that we did speak to the LGBTQ community, women with disabilities, women who've survived rape or domestic violence, female genital mutilation survivors, and so on. But the numbers are pretty small. They were meant to be illustrative rather than representative, and the big factor that went into that decision making was participant safety. So where we felt that participants could be safe and comfortable talking to us and participating in the research is where we got access to the more sensitive communities. But the point is that sensitive communities face a lot more, compounded issues around safety and privacy relating to their identity to begin with, and access to even physical infrastructures. We also saw that religion has a role to play in many parts, because we spoke to women across different religious contexts in these various countries. particularly in areas like Nigeria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, religion had a larger role to play in access to the internet and what types of content they could get access to.
But that would be gendered also because, I mean.
That's right.
Yeah, so.
That's right. Everything is gendered. Yeah.
How do you imagine this can be translated while designing products, like the insights based on this work?
So there have been a number of different products that have come out of this work. We go into this in more detail in the gender report, g.co/gender equity online. But take, for example, device privacy, the set of findings around how women want to create their privacy controls over their applications. I think even simple things like just recognizing that content stays on devices beyond just that usage session is a starting point to understand that, well, there are histories and traces of content that can be left behind. So then how do we design for that to give people options to manage their privacy or to have the right kind of tools there. Abuse, for example, leads us to several questions and product implications around how we design our products in terms of their communication mechanisms, which can be exploited. What is the process of reporting abuse? Is that accessible? Is that discoverable? Is that friendly? And does action actually come out of reporting abuse? We saw, for example, that often when abuse is reported, it's not taken down because it is seen as ordinary content. Like abuse around a woman's photo may just be an ordinary thing, but it can be harmful to the person reporting the content. So just, I think there are several implications for content moderation teams to be trained around cultural nuances and sensitivities. Similarly, for some of the relevant content, the findings around lack of relevant content, again, when you have far fewer women than men online, there are several questions that come up in the fairness of the content that's presented to people and how we train our data, train our models based on the data sets, not by default, but for adjusting for the different subgroups and making sure that it's equally meaningful to different subgroups that browse the internet. But I encourage you to check out the report. There's a lot more there.
Yeah, very interesting and important work. So I was wondering if you came across any platforms which are for same gender only. And so related to that is it seems that the abuse goes from one gender to other, or made by one gender to the other. Is that what you saw throughout, or you also saw instances came across where the abuse was in the same gender?
Oh, that's interesting. So digital abuse in our research, and I think many other research studies will support this, seems to be cross-gender broadly. However, that doesn't mean that members of the same gender are not don't create barriers to the access of the internet. So, for example, especially in rural contexts, we would see that mother-in-laws or mothers may have different notions of the internet, which they don't want their daughters or their daughter-in-law to be affected by these harms. So some same-gender members can, of course, internalize these patriarchal notions and keep women and non-binary people away. Digital abuse was largely cross-gender. And no, we did not see any same-gender applications, but we saw spaces that were being made. So, for example, same-gender WhatsApp groups were used by several of our participants, where they expressed that they were a lot more comfortable asking questions and responding to messages. Several applications were also brought up in our interviews that made design considerations for gender. So Redbus, which is a ticket booking service for buses in India, automatically allocates seating for women based on their gender with other women, so they can share their space with other women. So these were applauded in the research when noticed.